Good morning, Year 4. I hope you're ready for your Wednesday English lesson today. So I'm just going to share my screen with you. Okay, so if you could pause the video and write today's date, Wednesday the 13th of January, and LO to write complex sentences. Don't forget to underline your both things with a ruler, please. Good. Okay, so today we're going to be writing using complex sentences. Okay, now before we do that, let's just remind ourselves about what we wrote yesterday. It's always good to come back to your work a day after because you might spot some mistakes that you made, maybe missing commas or capital letters. So yesterday we wrote about the bit where the ant or the queen ant was ordering her troops, just got to the point where she had got them into a large ball that looked like this. So I'm going to reread my last sentence, which looked like this. The ant somersaulted, dived and hopped into an orderly formation. Okay, now you wrote an independent sentence to finish off your paragraph. So if you could reread that now to check it makes sense. Okay, now before we can write in complex sentences today, let's just remind ourselves what a complex sentence is. Now to do that, we have to think about, first of all, what a sentence has, and sentences aren't sentences unless they have a clause in them. Okay, now sentences usually have a main clause and sometimes they have a subordinate clause. Now, a main clause is the part of the sentence that makes sense on its own. Let's read about it. So a main clause, or in a simple sentence, is a group of words that expresses one complete thought. That means it makes sense on its own. Every main clause must contain a subject and a verb. They can also be called independent clauses. We usually call them main clauses, don't we? Now, if you're wondering what the subject and the verb is in a sentence, let's remind ourselves. So the subject is the thing that you're talking about. Here we've got the noun, the horse, that is the subject in this simple sentence. And it is doing something. It is galloping. So that is the verb. Remember, that's the activity. Okay, the verb is the action that the noun takes or the subject takes in this instance. So a complex sentence is one that is made up of a main clause and one or more dependent clauses, or we call them usually subordinate clauses in class, don't we? Okay. Now, to create a complex sentence, we use these subordinating conjunctions, don't we? And we've talked lots about these, and we usually call them I saw a wobub. Now, if you imagine that's the wobub hiding behind the tree, and these letters represent these conjunctions, these subordinating conjunctions. So we have if, since, as, when, although, while, after, before, until, and because. Now in Year 4, we try to see if we can use as many of these conjunctions as we can in our writing. Sometimes we're very good at using as, we use that quite a lot, and because, but we want to see if we can really try and stretch ourselves to use the more tricky ones like although and while and since. Okay, so today that's my challenge. How many can you use? Not in one sentence, but in a variety of different sentences can you use the different subordinating conjunctions? Now, subordinating conjunctions are the first words within a subordinate clause. Subordinate clauses do not make sense on their own. They are dependent, but when they're used in a main clause, they create a complex sentence. So, for example, subordinate clauses will always have a subject and a verb within them. So you always need to make sure that when you're writing complex sentences today, they have a subject, what you're talking about, and the verb, what that subject is doing. Let's have a go now. Now, within this sentence, can you spot the subordinate clause? Now remember, the subordinate clause is the bit that doesn't make sense on its own. You wouldn't go up to somebody and just speak in subordinate clauses. It wouldn't make any sense. So let's read this sentence. Juvenile penguins are able to swim, although their feathers are not yet waterproof. Read out loud the bit that doesn't make sense on its own. That's a subordinate clause. Well done. So the subordinate clause here is this part of the sentence where it says, although their feathers are not yet waterproof. Remember, you wouldn't go up to someone and say, although their feathers are not yet waterproof. They wouldn't know what you were talking about. It wouldn't make any sense, would it? And that is the subordinate clause. Now, my challenge is this. Can you rewrite this sentence so that subordinate clause starts the sentence, so it's at the front, so it would start with the word although? Pause the video now and challenge yourself to rewrite that sentence with the subordinate clause at the start. Okay, well done. Now, hopefully your sentence should look like this. Although their feathers are not yet waterproof, juvenile penguins are able to swim. Notice that after my subordinate clause, I put a comma. Now, it's really important in Year 4 that we always remember to put our commas in the correct place. I'm going to circle that to remind you today. If you're writing complex sentences that start with a subordinate clause, after the subordinate clause, there must always be a comma. Okay, let's go back to our model of excellence now. Now, we've read this many times, and this time I'd like to look for subordinate clauses or complex sentences within it. So I'd like you now to pause the video and see if you can find a couple of complex sentences. Okay, well done. Now remember, our complex sentences will have a subordinating conjunction in them, and here are the subordinating conjunctions that I saw a wobub. If, since, as, when, although, while, after, before, until, because. Okay, so we can try and see if we can spot those used in a sentence where there is a subordinating clause. Okay. Here we have one. Imposing ice structures meandered menacing through the freezing waters while an eerie silence filled the air. So here we have a good example of a complex sentence. While an eerie silence filled the air is the subordinating clause. It wouldn't make sense on its own, but the main clause would make sense on its own. Imposing ice structures meandered menacingly through the freezing waters. Can we find any others? Pause the video and see if you can find any more. Okay, now I'm going to go on to our task today. We're going to be writing some complex sentences about these scenes. Okay, now what I'd like you to do is, and you can do this perhaps with your grown-up or perhaps with a friend that you could phone, I want you to talk about what's happening in these pictures. These are stills from the animation. And I want you to think carefully about what the subject is in each scene and what the subject is doing in each scene. Talk it through and see how many sentences you can come up with just talking about it. So pause the video and do that now. Well done. Let's have a look at this scene here, number 1. What's happening here? Well, who is the subject in this scene and what is the subject doing? Well, I thought that the subject probably was the Queen Ant. Here she is. And she looks like she is ordering her troops to do something. Look at her hands. They're flying all over the place. She's given them lots of orders. She's bossing them around, isn't she? She's telling them what to do. She's being a good leader. She's helping them. So I've written some sentences that use this subject and this verb, and I've created some complex sentences. Now here's my simple sentence to start off with. The Queen Ant ordered her troops to form a ball. That makes sense completely on its own. That is a simple sentence, but I'm going to extend it now and I'm going to make a complex sentence. The Queen Ant ordered her troops to form a ball as she had a cunning idea to stop the anteater. Here's my subordinating conjunction. Here's my subordinate clause. I've used this one, as. I'm going to challenge myself now to see if I can think of a different sentence. Before I show you mine, why don't you pause the video to see if you can come up with a complex sentence that describes this scene. Well done. So let's see if I can use a different way a different conjunction to write a complex sentence. This time I've put my subordinating conjunction at the start. While the anteater inhaled deeply, the queen ant ordered her troops to form a ball. Here I have my subordinate clause at the front. And look, I've remembered to put my comma there because that's very important that I do. Let's go on to our task today. So your task is to write sentences about each of these scenes. You're going to write complex sentences to describe each of these scenes. And you can think of more than one complex sentence for each one. Now remember that for each one, think about the subject in the sentence and what they're doing, the verb. So for example, here, the subject might be the ball of ants, or it could be the queen ant. And what is the ball doing? It's rolling, it's tumbling. The queen ant is climbing or clambering. Then think in this scene, who is the subject and what is happening? What's the verb? It could be the anteater, sucking, or the ball, blocking. Here again, look what's happening to the subject here, the anteater. He's turning red. He's been starved of oxygen. He's just about to faint, isn't he? So think of as many sentences as you can for each of these three scenes. Now your challenge today is to use a variety of subordinating conjunctions. Don't just use the usual ones as and because. Perhaps you could use before, until, although. Now remember with although, that's a contrasting one, isn't it? It needs to in some way contrast with the main clause when you use it. Your digging deeper today would be to try and write complex sentences that start with a subordinate clause at the beginning of the sentence, and I'm going to be looking closely today to see if the comma is in the correct place. So pause the video now and have a go at this task. This writing task should take you about 15 to 20 minutes if you're doing it correctly. And remember, talk through your sentences before you write them. And if you want to check your work at the end, remember to pop your fingers in your ears and read them out loud so you can hear the mistakes that you made. It's far easier to notice that when you do. OK, I really look forward to seeing all your work later on. And I'll see you tomorrow.